Welcome to the Dark Zone, an adventure racing podcast.
I'm just a regular guy. I'm nobody important. And that's what I think why I resonate with people, my audience. Here's a regular guy that does these wacky things or does these interviews, and I'm no different than the listener or the reader. It's just that I've gone out and done it.
Well, for me, the action is the juice. I'm in.
How can you not be romantic about adventure racing?
It's a metaphor.
I know it's a metaphor.
Say the word, Chef.
Let it rip.
Welcome to the Dark Zone Adventure Racing Podcast. This is your host, Brian Gatens. Episode 135. We're coming off a whole slate of episodes coming from the Endless Mountains Adventure Race, and that was great and a lot of fun. And thank you to Rootstock Racing and Brent Nabby and all the racers for such a great experience. We were delighted to cover that race with such depth, and it truly deserved it. What a race, what an experience. For this episode, we're shifting gears a little bit. As listeners know, I like to push outside the world of adventure racing. I look for adventurers and writers and reporters and interesting people who bring their experiences to our world, and we could reflect on that and apply that into adventure racing. So the guest for today's episode is a gentleman named Jim Clash. I met Jim at Everest Day at the Explorers Club in New York City. He was the host for a talk involving the son of Tenzing Norgay as well as Conrad Anker. And Jim was very gracious and he was very funny, and he was kind enough to come onto the show and talk about his depth of experience as a writer and as an adventurer and all that he's learned along the way. So while it's not directly adventure racing content, it is adventure racing adjacent, and it's about mindset and logistics and reliability and risk and all the things that resonate with us in our sport. So sit back and relax, enjoy episode 135 of The Dark Zone, and remember, if you keep racing, we'll keep talking. For over 40 years, the American Himalayan Foundation has been on the ground, partnering with visionary leaders across the region. They bring education to girls at risk of being trafficked. They fund surgeries for children with disabilities who would otherwise be left behind. They support Tibetan refugees, protect fragile mountain environments, and stand by communities through earthquakes, pandemics, and floods. The foundation doesn't do fanfare, they do results. Quietly, relentlessly, with grit, respect, and deep local trust. If you've ever trekked, climbed, raced, or dreamed of the Himalaya, this is a way to give back to the people who call those mountains their home. www.himalayan-foundation.org. And as always with all of our charity partners, they pay nothing for this ad. Thank you for your support, and please visit their website. Welcome to the Dark Zone, an Adventure Race podcast. This is your host, Brian Gatens. So recently I had the chance to go to an event at the Explorers Club in New York City around Everest Day, and Conrad Anker was there. Jimmy Chin popped in at the very end. Tenzing Norgay's son was there. And the event was moderated by a man named Jim Clash, who is today's guest. And over the course of the interview, Jim came across as someone who is just steeped in adventure. He's steeped in excitement. He's done all these great things, and his resume is so deep, and you'll see a link in the show notes about all of his writing for Forbes magazine. In honor of his event there, in honor of Everest, I'm going to ask Jim to talk a bit about, first, his experience with mountaineering, and then we're going to see where his adventures have gone. Because for the listeners, sit back and relax, because I can tell you right now, Jim has a ton of adventure stories. Jim, welcome to the Dark Zone. Thank you for your time. Tell us about your adventures as it comes to mountaineering, of all the adventures you've done.
Well, thank you, Brian. Thanks for having me on. As not an adventure racer myself, I hope that this, whatever I say, can transition to what you guys do. I respect what you guys do. I know it's tough, and I've done a lot of tough stuff, so I know sort of what's involved. Mountaineering, I started way back, in the 80s with Dick Bass writing that book, The Seven Summits. And it was a book about how two executives in their 50s went out to try to climb the seven highest mountains on each continent. And they did it. And it was like this armchair thing where you thought, God, if they can do it at their age, I can do it. So I started climbing mostly in the Tetons, Grand Teton, Mount Owen, all that. And then I went on to bigger stuff in Mexico, the volcanoes there, Popocatépetl, and then to Ecuador to do Cotopaxi, and eventually Aconcagua, which is the highest mountain in the world outside of Asia, 23,000 feet. That was endurance. And then I actually thought about Everest at the time, but it's very expensive. And I was asked to go on the Into Thin Air expedition with Scott Fisher, where all those people were killed. And I just remember thinking, Scott, I don't think I'm ready for Everest. I'd climbed Kilimanjaro with him in January, and they went to Everest in April. And of course, Scott died, and a lot of people died. And John Krakauer wrote that famous book, Into Thin Air. So I'm glad I didn't go. I could either be dead, I could be John Krakauer, or I could have a lot of frostbite like Beck Weathers. And then, I'm older now, so I don't do much climbing. The Matterhorn was probably the best climb I ever did. It was difficult. It was crowded and dangerous. It's killed over 500 people. So, and it was a one-day climb from the base to the top and then back down. I think to the top it's 6 hours, back down it's 9, so it's a lot harder coming down. So that's really where I started doing the adventure stuff. And then Forbes had asked me to write a column in the back of the book, the life section, about, climbing the Matterhorn. What was it like? In the front of the book, I wrote about investing. I wrote about mutual funds, stock market. Back of the book, we had the life section. So I wrote it up, and the advertisers really liked it. There was a trend toward adventure experiences rather than buying another boat or house in the Hamptons with rich people. So they said, well, you can't just do mountain climbing. You have to do other stuff. I said, okay, I can find some other stuff to do.
It was like, oh, twist my arm. Oh, okay, I have to do more adventure-y things. Count me in.
Yeah, I mean, and again, what I do is I don't just write it up like a press release. I actually go and experience the adventure in a real serious way. I take risks like the people who do it full time, and I think they appreciate that. But that's the only way, as an experiential journalist, I can sort of convey it to my readers. So if you read one of my stories and feel like you're with me, I've done my job.
And so when you had the growth into the mountaineering and you had a chance to do all these experiences and it blossomed from there, that gave you the opportunity to a wide range of people. I know that you've interviewed General Chuck Yeager, and also you're a esteemed music journalist. So you interviewed Grace Slick. And so you become this amazing observer as well as a reporter from these very, very unique individuals that do these things. So talk to me a bit about the idea of mindset. When you interview them, what jumps out at you about the way that they see the world?
Well, first of all, it's difficult to get them, and it's easier now that I've interviewed a number of them because I have a name out there. But I only interview people that I want to interview if it's in the music business, because that's kind of a sideline for me. Like Art Garfunkel, I wanted to interview him. I wanted to interview, Mickey Dolenz from the Monkees. Just some of the people I grew up with in the 60s on music. But what I've learned is a couple of things about interviewing celebrities. And believe me, I've interviewed, as you say, Yeager and John Glenn and Neil Armstrong and, Elon Musk, just a number of important people, but you really never talk about yourself. I know everybody wants to say, like I could say to John Glenn, ooh, I flew in a MiG, to 84,000 feet. He doesn't care. He flew into space as the first American to orbit the Earth. So, people want to impress whoever they're interviewing with their own whatever in that industry, and you just don't do it. It wastes time that you have with them, which is precious, and they don't care. Secondly, do a lot of research on these people before you interview them. But I would say don't do too much, because if you do too much, you know the answers to the questions you're going to ask, and you might start to finish their sentence or whatever. And so I would say, do enough research so you don't look stupid, but at the same time, leave a little room for real questions, and don't get too obscure. Another thing I would say is you may have a list of 10 or 15 questions. It depends on how long the interview is. Sometimes they say it's going to be 10 minutes and an hour later you're still talking to them because you get on with them. Alan Alda, that happened with Alan Alda. So you have more questions than you need always. And then if someone starts to answer a question in a different way than what you asked, in other words, they start to answer a different question, don't cut them off if it's interesting. Let it go. Later on, you can make up a question for that answer, but come back to that. And then if something's, say you have question 7 and question 3, but question 3 is leading into question 8 or whatever, be flexible enough to go, across the question, not in terms of the order or importance. So it makes it logical. For print, for me, it's a lot easier because I can change things around, all that. For you, it's probably more difficult on a podcast, although you can edit it. I would say treat them with respect. But I would say that if you're aggressive, sometimes you can get more time than the handlers want you to have. Usually they'll have a PR person as a guard or something like that. And you can ask questions that are somewhat difficult for them. And sometimes they'll answer them and sometimes they won't. But I would say leave those questions for the end of the interview because you don't want to anger them. But yeah, and for me, having done some of this stuff, they've seen my resume usually before I do the interview. So they know that I kind of know what it's like to do what they do.
And obviously they want to, the subject they're interviewing expects you to come into an interview with a baseline of understanding about who they are, right? There's a fine line between being a neophyte about them and being an avatar for the audience, but then also them saying to themselves, wait, this person didn't even respect me enough to learn about me, right? So there's that fine line there. Do you find that when you interview people and you talk to them, especially the adventurers who've done these amazing things, do they enjoy talking about their accomplishments, or do you find they're kind of buttoned up?
It depends. Like a lot of the astronauts and aviation people, they're taught not to really feel. They're taught to do their jobs. And, I've had various responses. The first time I interviewed Buzz Aldrin, I asked him, what did it feel like to step on the moon? And that was the first time I'd ever interviewed him, and I was kind of a newbie to journalism. And he looked at me and he said, can you give me a multiple choice list of answers about how it should have felt? As far as I was concerned, we were proceeding with the checklist. There's a lot to do. And I was kind of appalled by that at the time, and I felt stupid. But now I realize that he was really answering the question honestly. It wasn't like making something up. And in fact, he went on to say, I suppose I could, if you give me a multiple choice list of answers, I could make something up, but that's how I felt. So, I would say that also, you get nervous sometimes. Like when I interviewed Simon and Garfunkel are one of my favorite all-time groups. And so partway into the interview, I accidentally called him Paul. Of course, Paul and Art. So I kept talking like nothing had happened. And about 5 seconds later, he goes, Jim, I heard that. And I said, oh, I'm so sorry. Art goes, don't worry. It happens all the time. So, humor's a big part of interviewing people, too. And for me, it's putting them at ease in the beginning. I'm just a regular guy. I'm nobody important. And that's what I think why I resonate with people, my audience. Here's a regular guy that does these wacky things or does these interviews, and I'm no different than the listener or the reader. It's just that I've gone out and done it. So I try to be very humble, but I like to use humor too. Again, I've interviewed a lot of people. I've learned a lot in the process, but I think the biggest thing is just to be yourself.
Yeah, I think I remember reading The Right Stuff and the interviews with the early Mercury and the Apollo astronauts. One of the most challenging things about interviewing guys like Chuck Yeager were the fact that they were very mission driven, right? They set aside the feelings that they were having. Their job was to get the job done, and they were not going to create time in their mind to reflect upon what was happening in the moment. And that even kind of carried over into their life, right? There was I think Tom Hanks told a story about Apollo 13 that when he interviewed the astronauts there, they were like, it was scary, it was hard, it was challenging, and he was getting like these one-word answers out of them, and he never had a chance to sort of dig into what the experience was like for them. So that being said, and knowing that these subjects are tough, what are some of the things that you've learned along the way about their mindset that helped them to succeed?
Well, I think one thing is practicality and the ability to differentiate between real risk and perceived risk. I deal with this all the time when I do something. People, I give rides at Daytona, about 170 miles an hour around the track. for customers in NASCAR racing experience for fun. It's in fact, I'm going down to Daytona soon to do it again. And my friends say, "Oh, Jim, are you crazy? You're taking people around the track at 170 miles an hour. That's really dangerous." But those same people will drive their SUV in and out of traffic at 85 miles an hour. They're dead if they wreck. I'm not. I'm in a specially prepared car with a 5-point harness system, a helmet, a fireproof suit. So again, you have to look at what's the real risk. I know mountain climbers or boulderers who'll go to Central Park in New York, and they'll go up a 60-foot boulder without any protection, without any ropes. And, they yell at me for climbing the Matterhorn. Well, the Matterhorn, I've got ropes. They don't. If they fall 60 feet, they're either going to die or be paralyzed. So again, you got to differentiate. So I think a lot of these especially adventurers, they know the difference between real risk and perceived risk. And I would say that the other thing they have in common is they're very curious people. I once asked James Cameron, the director of Titanic, and I also asked John Glenn separately, what is exploration to you? And they both came up with the same answer: curiosity in action. So I think that most people who push the limits are curious people. I'm curious. What's it like to see a tornado, fly through a Category 5 hurricane, drive a car at 253 miles an hour? What is that like? So I think these people are curious. If they're in the military, they're very disciplined, and they don't get scared per se, because for every disaster or potential disaster, they have a backup plan, and they practice that for many times before they do the real thing. I remember Buzz telling me when they landed on the moon and Neil said, "Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed." He looked at Neil and said, "What are you doing?" Because they never really practiced that line. They wanted to keep it for the real thing. And he forgot that they were doing the real thing because they had simulated it like 450 times in Houston. So, these people, they're perseverant. A lot of the rockers, have gone through a lot of playing in small clubs and people throwing bottles at them and everything before they made it. Creedence Clearwater is a good example with John Fogerty. They played as the Gollywogs for 10 years, totally unknown at little places. And then finally they signed a deal with Fantasy Records, which turned into be a disaster. But, John Fogerty wrote like 20 hits in the span of like 4 years. So, but America wants to see overnight successes, and most of them are.
Well, that's the idea of it being like an overnight success being 20 years in the making, right? Yeah. And that's an important point for our listeners too, because adventure racing is in many ways it's a simple sport, but it's also it's a complex sport. And we always tell newer racers that like if you have a tough time your first couple races, your first year of races, it's okay. Nobody is born at a high level. And that's what you're saying through your wide variety of interviews. You've seen that time and time again with these people who, by the way, are considered geniuses and masters. There was that practice. There was that playing in the small clubs. There was the going through the basic training. You've seen that time and time again.
Yeah, and again, there's an old saying, success is just failure in disguise. So if you learn, as you're saying, as you go along, don't get discouraged because you'll get better at it if you persevere it. So if you learn something from your mistake, then you're going to move. You're going to move ahead. If you don't, well, don't make the same mistake over and over. It can be fatal. But with the adventurers and the astronauts and whatnot, and I'm sure in your sport, you have to be careful of hypothermia in certain areas, or, you become dehydrated to the point where it's dangerous, or was it heat stroke and things like that. So again, you have to learn your body and you have to learn your limits, and you have to be practical. In the mountains, a lot of people die because they don't realize their limitations. On Everest especially, I think it's 80% of all accidents and fatalities are on the way down. Yep. And a lot of that's due to fatigue, to the fact that you let your guard down because you made it to the top. I remember Sir Edmund Hillary telling me that, we asked about George Mallory, who we don't know if he made it to the summit in 1924. And I said, what do you think? And he said, well, when I was on top of Everest, I looked around for any remnants of him, and there weren't any. But he said, even if there there were things up there, he didn't quite get the job done. The job is to go to the top and come down safely. And he and Tenzing Norgay did that. So I'll tell you one other thing about how adventurers think. I asked Hillary what he remembered on the top when he was up there in the short time. And he said, well, I looked around, of course, for Mallory's remnants, and I looked. We got our pictures because it was a very unbelieving world. But then I remember looking across the great Khumbu Valley at the Peak Makalu, which hadn't been climbed. And I started to work a route out in my mind about how it could be climbed because no one had ever seen it from that high. And then he said, I realized here I was on top of the world thinking about my next potential adventure. And so that's also something I think a lot of adventurers, including myself, we're thinking about the next thing while we're doing the thing that we're excited about in the moment. And I've been trying more to appreciate the moment and less, what's next.
Yeah, it's a running joke in adventure racing. There's two things. That when you're deep into a race and you're getting clobbered by the course and by the weather, you say to yourself, I'm never going to do this again. And then like a day after the race, you're thinking about your next race. Also, there's many a racer that driving home from the race in the passenger seat will be going through other races to talk to their team about that. Like we're coming off the mountain here. We've done this, and this is next there.
Yeah, but again, I think it's only natural for humans to want to push the next limit because that's how we've succeeded as a group, humankind. We want to go to the next level, and that pushes technology forward. It pushes a lot of things forward. But I think try to enjoy the moment. I was just up in a B-1 bomber, supersonic. The guy let me take the controls and bring it through the sound barrier. And I'm already thinking, well, gee, what would the B2 be like? And, I shouldn't be doing that. Now I have pictures and video, which I can look back on. And of course, when I describe it to my readers, it's in the moment and all that. But so I just would have that advice for anybody. And as you say, when you do these things, you're like, that was too tough. I'll never do that again. But then, you think about it and go, well, it wasn't that bad. You forget about the really bad stuff. Like when I skied to the South Pole, I was like, this is crazy. I remember going up to the guide and saying, if there's such a thing as reincarnation, I do not want to come back as a sled dog because we were pulling these giant. But anyway, later on you go, wow, I got to the South Pole. It wasn't that bad. I didn't die, didn't get frostbite.
Right. And the idea that we have these built-in forgetters, right? That part of the human dynamic is that we forget how hard things are and we focus on the reward of it. A lot of the pursuits you talk about are only successful because teams are involved, right? Nobody does anything by themselves. And, Hillary's a great example of that. Mm-hmm. So you've been exposed to a lot of solid teamwork over the years. Can you talk a bit about teams that you've observed that have done really well and teams that have fallen apart? And I share this with you because adventure racing at its core is a team-based sport. And it's all about that dynamic makes up for a lot, or teams really fall apart if they're not careful about that.
I think one of the bigger examples, I've never participated on this level, but I watch the Americans in the 400-meter relay every Olympics. And more often than not, they drop the damn baton because as a team, they don't work together. You have 4 people handing the baton off, each running 100 meters. And then you have other teams that aren't as fast from other countries that have practiced for 4 years to do that event. And they don't drop the baton or pass it outside the zone. So I think there's an example of where teamwork isn't involved, and it doesn't work without the teamwork. In terms of teamwork that works, I mean, if you think about NASA and going to the moon, Neil Armstrong had 450,000 people behind him at NASA. He was the tip of the spear, and he admits that. And he has a lot to say about those people on the team. They all were going for the same thing. And so I think there's an example of where it works. The Blue Angels, of course, same thing. I've flown with the Blue Angels, and, they're incredibly good at what they do, but they do it as a team. Right. One guy screws up, a lot of people are going to die. So they take it seriously and they train. And I think anybody who's on a team has to train, and you have to let your ego go a little bit because you have to be a contributing team member in whatever area you're contributing.
Yeah, one of the most common dynamics that we see in our team-based sport is that when you're having a hard time during the race, one teammate will take another teammate's pack for a period of time. They'll pass it off, and you're ascending, and you're not necessarily carrying
some weight with you, and how that's very rejuvenating for those teammates. And so that's one thing we see, and we always tell newer racers, like, giving up your pack and asking for help is not a failure, but instead you're sacrificing yourself for the good of the team. Because if you stand on ego, the team's going to fall apart, and then it's a mess. And I remember too, you mentioned, going to the moon, and I remember I saw the famous photo of, on top of their immersion control, someone had put a sign up, and it said, "It will not fail because of me." Like, they knew that as much as they were one person in a huge, system putting this into the sky, that they knew that they played a certain role, and if they fell apart, the whole thing could fall apart.
Yeah, and again, I know I've asked many famous people who take risks, how do you deal with fear? And they said, my biggest fear is of effing up, because then I let the team down. I'm not afraid of the rocket blowing up or, something like that happening, my pressure suit losing a seal. It's about screwing up. And it's funny when they say it, but it's not. I know when I do an adventure, there's a lot of pressure on me to go ahead and make it work. There's maybe a video crew there. Forbes has sent me out there. The Air Force has, had generals sign off, like on my U-2 flight recently. That was, it was 8 years in the making. So I better be able to do what I need to do in that spacesuit and fly up in the U-2 to 73,000 feet when I trained. Because if I don't, and that project falls apart, there's a lot of people who are going to be upset, including myself. So
right.
It's a team effort.
Yeah, and the other part of it too is the idea of the preparation and preparing and getting ready for it is that you have to realize, and I say this myself, the greatest motivator for me on a 4-person team is you don't want to be the 4th person on that team. You want to be able to carry the team to work hard. And so when you're out there, you're training, you're not really training for your own experience, but you don't want to take away from the experience of other people. And that's a nice thing. I'm really, and first off, thanks for being a great guest, because that's a key thing that you're mentioning for adventure racers, right? That you have to realize that other people rely upon you for all of that. Jim, you touched about the idea of preparation, and you realized that you had to get ready for these things. 8 years in the making, people relying upon you. And so clearly we've checked off the box of why it's important to train. I'm curious about the idea of logistics, that you do these incredibly complex trips, these endeavors, and the successes in the planning. Can you talk about how you approach logistics? Because you're new to adventure racing, we get these long lists of equipment we can bring. There's bins have to be transferred. There's a lot of logistics for us, and sometimes we screw it up. And so to not screw it up, what's your approach to logistics?
I would say, and I always say, that you're only as good as your weakest link. And logistics is a lot like that. I mean, if your boots don't show up in Argentina to climb Aconcagua, they've been broken in, you're in trouble. Or this sort of thing. So I'm almost anal about all that kind of stuff. Airfare, connections. When I go to Daytona, I'm always worried about not making a connecting flight where then I can't drive on the track. So I'm really careful about that. I plan it out to the point of almost being annoying. But again, you're only as good as your weakest link. So I would say logistically, you got to plan for not just what can go right, but what can go wrong. And so I'm like that. And I would say anybody who's doing an adventure race or whatever, make sure you're in good shape. I mean, don't fool around with that, because you just can't do it. Like when I climbed Aconcagua, I spent a year going up and down steps with a pack on, 20 flights, like 10 times in a row, because I knew what it was going to be like on the mountain. And then you got to be really careful, because, if you're at base camp and you drink water that you haven't purified, you can get giardia or something, and that'll wreck you can't go to the summit if you're sick.
Right.
So there's all kinds of things, that you really have to think about. And again, for me, the fear is always not getting the logistics right and not being able to do what I have to do when I have to function or focus. So again, my fears are always weird. Like when I go up in the U-2, I can't go to the bathroom. So what am I going to do? I'll be in that spacesuit for 6 hours.
Right.
Now, technically you can, but I didn't want to fool around with that. But I just dehydrated myself 12 hours before. I just didn't drink anything, which is not a good move, but it got me through it. I rehydrated later. But, and those are kind of things that scare me. the weather. Is the weather going to be right? If, say, on summit day you've gone 3 weeks on the mountain, and Everest it's even more, and you got this day to summit. If the weather's bad, don't go. That's
so let me ask you that question then, because the idea of summit fever, right?
Yeah.
And you've been mountaineering for a long time, right? And clearly you've not succumbed to summit fever because you're sitting here talking to me. What do you tell yourself when you're that close to a destination, but it's a bad, like, how do you walk us through that decision making?
I think it's being rational, and sometimes it's hard to be rational because of the altitude and how you aren't thinking correctly. The other is maybe for Everest, you spent $100,000 to do that climb.
Right.
And, you're like, geez, this one day the weather's not good. I would say that, the mountain's still going to be there next year or tomorrow or the day after. So you have to be able to, in your mind, adjust your time horizon. It's not easy. I mean, I know. I've never actually had to turn around or had a weather situation where I literally had to go back down. But, we've had to wait sometimes a week for a snowstorm to go. And if we hadn't done that, who knows if I'd be here or not. Same with the race cars. When I'm out there, you can't have any moisture on the track.
Right.
And sometimes it's very difficult at Daytona when you've got 100 people who've paid for rides that come from 20 different countries, and you've got some moisture on the track from a shower. You got to let it dry, because in a car like that, a NASCAR, you're just going to slide and hit the wall.
Right.
So
right.
you got to be patient, and then you've got to be able to talk to the customers and make them understand why we can't go out. So, it's always a risk. It's risk versus reward. Be practical about it. But yes, summit fever, that kills a lot of people. It killed people on the Into Thin Air mess in 1996 with John Krakauer's book. They knew a storm was coming. They tried to beat it, and on the way down, they got caught in it. So
yeah. Yeah, we had researchers on the podcast not too long ago, and what they were talking about was that one thing a team has to do in an extreme situation, you have to have a brutal understanding of reality. You can't talk yourself into a different narrative. And they were talking about it in the context of getting lost during a race, because adventure racing is all map and compass. And very often navigators do a great job, but you'll find yourself in a place where you've lost track of where you are on the map. And you begin to tell yourself a story about what you want to believe, because the turning around is hard, meaning you're lost is hard. And so you trick yourself into thinking, no, this is fine. It's just over the next ridge. And you only begin to compound the failure, begin to compound the hole that you find yourself in. Have you been on expeditions that have come apart at the seams?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's if you're on a team and you only have a certain amount of resources and guides and Sherpas, if there's a weak member of the team, he needs to realize that, or she needs to realize that, and go down. And, I've been on expeditions where these people don't want to do that, and it endangers the whole group because they paid a lot of money, and you can understand that. And maybe they don't know their limitations, but the guides know your limitations. The Sherpas know it. They're smart. I mean, the guide services, you have professional mountain climbers taking you up, and they can see you and how you're behaving on different altitudes and on different carries to whatever camp. You may not understand what's happening with your body, but they do, and you need to listen to that. I remember one time I was on Mount Rainier, and we climbed up to the hut at 10,000 feet in horrible rain and sleet, and we're like, oh God, we're going down tomorrow, blah blah blah, almost hypothermic. And then all of a sudden it clears up at 2 a.m. and we're going for the top. Everybody's excited. There's 24 of us. We're roped up in teams of 6, and we get up about 7 in the morning, and it's beautiful, and we're all excited, and the guide says, we're going down. And we're like, what? After all we went through yesterday, and now it's perfect? He said, you see that area right above us? That's iced. And if we slip there, we will not be able to get our ice axes into self-arrest, and we'll go right off the mountain. And we were grumbling and like, angry, and we passed other climbers going up. And we said, why are they going up? And he said, they shouldn't be. And later that day, 3 climbers were killed exactly where he had told us it was dangerous. So we all wrote thank you letters to the guy.
We take it back.
Yeah, but I learned at that point that you never second guess a guide because they're professionals. When we were at this event the other night with Norbu and Conrad, I think it was Norbu was telling me a story about a guy who was on Everest recently who just wouldn't turn around. They told him he didn't have what it took. And so the Sherpa started leading him up, and of course he died, and the Sherpa died because he felt loyalty, for the guy. Again, that's just selfish, and I think you have to realize at some point either you have it or you don't, or maybe you're sick that day, but for the good of the team and the good of people who are trying to help you, like Sherpas or guides, on the Into Thin Air mess with Scott Fisher and Rob Hall and the clients that died, they all died because they were trying to save the clients. They could have gone down. They're professionals, right? And honestly, if you want to get into Everest, I'll say one thing. Right now, you've got a line of 100 people in one day trying to go to the summit. It's insane. If you see a picture of it, you'll think it's AI. It's not. And what these people don't realize is there's one storm comes in, 100 people are going to die. There's no way down except that same ridge. The guides are going to die trying to save these people. The Sherpas are going to die trying to save these people. So right now, I think Mount Everest is the most dangerous it's ever been. And I don't think these amateur climbers who are clients who pay a lot of money to do this realize it. And something's going to happen, as Norbu and Conrad said the other night at our presentation.
And I may be misremembering what I read recently, but I thought I read something that Nepal was considering requiring there to be the requirement that anybody climbing Everest must have ascended another 8,000 meter peak someplace else before coming to Everest. Have you heard about that?
I don't think Nepal has done that per se. According to Norbu, it's like they just want to raise the price of the permit, and the government gets the money. I think permits now are 11,000 a piece, and they want to raise it to 15,000, which may deter some people but most of these rich people, that's nothing to them. Right. I think the guide services, some of the guide services, like Ed Viesters, I've talked to him. He's one of the great American mountaineers. And he told me what the guide services need to do is require that kind of background, maybe an 8,000 meter peak before they attempt Everest. But right now, there's really no regulation. And it's up to the guide services to police them. It's up to Nepal to sell the permits to people who are qualified. And unfortunately for the Sherpa, they make all their money in that 8-week period of taking stuff up Everest and taking people up. So it's incentive for them to keep doing it whether they die or not, so
it's a fascinating overlapping Venn diagram of economic needs, international commerce, ego, accomplishment. Like it appears it all collapses. It all comes together at Everest, and all these other factors come into place. Who wants to get paid? Who needs to make money? Who wants to make money? Like there's a whole that challenge there. And and it's amazing how Everest has become the most dangerous mountain in the world, not because of Everest, but because of the human beings that are on Everest. That's what makes it the most dangerous in the world.
Yeah, and again, I don't think these people realize, they're in a group of others and they think, oh, I'm safe because there are a lot of people around me. The reality is they're a lot less safe. The other thing that bothers me in all of adventure now is people wanting to get these Guinness records for ridiculous things. And sometimes it's dangerous. I remember, I was looking into it. There was a Guinness record given out last year, I think, for the fastest 10 meters on a skateboard by a cat. And it's like, what? But there are people who want to get that distinguishment. And, there was a really bad accident maybe a year or two ago on Shishapangma, which is an 8,000 meter peak. And there were these two women trying to go for a Guinness record. Yeah. And Shishapangma was their last mountain.
Yep.
So they were
read about this.
Yeah, they were both on the mountain at the same time, and both went up in really bad avalanche conditions. They were told not to go up by the guides, and they went up from different sides of the mountain to see who could get up there first, and they both died in avalanches. For what? A Guinness record? Right. Stupid. So some of the Guinness records are really dumb. some of them are like, well, why risk your life for that? And, there's all kinds of that stuff, like that Titan submersible mess a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, where these people died basically it was a garbage can. It wasn't well built. I was invited to go down on that thing at one point, and I looked at it. I talked to Jim Cameron. I talked to Victor Vescovo, who built the ones that went down to the Mariana Trench, and they said, do not get in that thing.
Right.
So again, I think
there's a documentary coming out now about that, saying how it had gone down so many times that the carbon fiber shell began to crack, and because nobody thought to take their time to look at it. Once again, preparation logistics, right? There's a team around it. Somebody probably suspected that something was wrong with that, right? And they said they could hear the noises, but once again, people paying a lot of money, pressure to get it done, social media, the media in general. They said we're gonna go, and next thing you know, no one survives.
Yeah, one of them was a billionaire. I think his name was Hamish Arding, and he had his kid with him. Mm-hmm. And he was called by Victor, I think, and James Cameron, and said, don't do it. But we were talking about summit fever. Some of these people just, they don't think it can happen to them, even if they're warned. It's like, I want to go see the Titanic. I paid my $250,000, and I'm going to do it. And they don't get it. They see a glossy brochure that says, hey, here it is. It's a Disney ride. And it's not. And again, that's a terrible example. But I think it's where adventure travel is going, because it's all becoming more and more accessible to people because of technology. And a lot of rich people have the money to do these things, but a lot of them don't have what it takes if it's a mountain. And you just have to be realistic. And I really fear for some of these things. Race car driving, there's just a lot of things that I report on and am involved in that I just see more and more danger, but not danger that you would think is there. For example, look at Dale Earnhardt when he died in that crash at Daytona. I think it was 2000. Mm-hmm. He didn't have a Hans device on, which is a
neck.
Yeah. So now everybody wears that. So you try to learn from mistakes, but again, it was kind of stupid not to wear it. And some of the racers were wearing it already. So again, now everybody wears it, but it's just kind of this, it's not a Disney World ride. And there's danger involved. And I could go on and on about this whole Katy Perry mess up with Blue Origin and that whole flight. And maybe we can if we have time. But there's another example of people just saying, oh, it's 11 minutes. It's a Disney ride. Nothing's going to happen. It's $1 million, whatever. It's got to be safe. It's not.
Right. I think to your point, and this will, I'm going to give you a big dose of hope right now. You're going to enjoy what I'm going to tell you, okay, because adventure racing, by virtue of the way the sport is, because it's human powered and because it's map and compass, you have to earn, if you will, the experience of an adventure race, right? And there's various distances and there's different ways to be a finisher in an adventure race. But one thing you can't do inside of our sport is that you can't shortcut your way to the accomplishment. I mean, the race director lays out a course. If you complete the course, you're a finisher. And I share that because when Conrad Anker spoke at the Explorers Club the other night, he talked about how one thing that he felt bad about with the current condition in Everest, with access to helicopters, things like that in his experience, it was getting to base camp, being among the other climbers, crossing the ice fall, all of the villages you pass through on the way to base camp. And the part he was making, and this is where adventure racing is the counterpoint to that, because in adventure racing, you have to do the work. To get to the faraway village, you have to get yourself there by foot, by bike, or by paddle. I think that our experience is so much richer because we earn the experience as opposed to buying our way into it, which is, I think, what you're talking about, that people try to buy their way into these experiences.
Yeah, I mean, look, in the old days, you'd climb Everest. There wasn't helicopters to take you above the icefall to Camp 1, where a lot of these rich people are now paying to not be a total part of the experience, okay? They're trying to cut corners. And as Conrad said, a lot of what's in it for you is the camaraderie, meeting people, helping each other go to the summit, whereas now it's a very singular thing. Everybody wants, what they want is that photo on top for their Wall Street office to show all their friends. and they'll do anything, cut any kind of corners to do it. And they don't have a lot of time, so they'll go to the mountain and they'll cut corners. A lot of them will breathe way more oxygen than you should be breathing. The Sherpas have to carry those bottles up. You've got even this xenon thing where these people trained in a hyperbaric chamber breathing xenon. I think it was in Germany.
Yeah, I read about that.
And they did in 6 days. They went to the top with all of the gas, oxygen. Is that fair? Is that a fun experience? All it is a trophy on your wall in your office. And Conrad was trying to make the point that if you all work hard, and there's much more satisfaction, I know, when I work hard in an adventure or whatever I'm doing, if I did it myself, and it wasn't easy skiing to the South Pole. We didn't take a plane. And so it's much more rewarding. And you probably know that from your racing, adventure racing.
Yeah. What's nice about, too, for us is that, like, for example, next week, and this is, by the way, listeners, this is coming out after the race, so you have to go back in time. But next week, there's a race called the Endless Mountains Adventure Race. And it's a 7-day race taking place in Vermont. There's 40 teams. There's roughly 160 racers, a bit less because not every team is 4. And for that 1 week, though, the race director, Rootstock Racing, creates a community in which those 40 teams will move through a 475-mile course, either on foot or by bike. And they will move as obviously teams in the front, teams in the back, but it will be this rolling community for those 7 days where everybody has that shared experience of passing through the gravel bike riding and the villages and the pack rafting and all of that. And then they all finish back at the spot where they basically back at the race headquarters. To your point, that's a hyper small focus of what happened on the mountain 25 years ago over those 6-10 weeks on the mountain. They do it inside 7 days where everybody buys into that experience. And to your point, you can't buy that experience. Like, you have to go and do it to say you've done it. And also, too, people want to hang it on their social media and want to put it on their wall. They want the picture on top of Everest to say I did that thing. But what you're getting to is the idea is that there's the doing it and there's the earning it. And those are two separate events.
Yeah, and let's go into this recent Blue Origin mess with Katy Perry and Gayle King, who flew on a 11-minute flight. They did go to space, no question. Space is considered 100 kilometers up. But they weren't wearing spacesuits, and that's very dangerous. If there was any kind of depressurization in that rocket cabin, they'd be dead in 3 seconds. They had on tight Lycra suits. Ridiculous. I had a ticket for a while in Virgin Galactic, which is the competitor to Blue Origin, Richard Branson's outfit to fly to suborbital space. First of all, if I had done it, I was not an astronaut. I would have been a space tourist, and that's, admit that, because if you start calling yourself an astronaut, you're slapping Neil Armstrong, those people, Sally Ride, in the face, because they earned it. They trained for it. They did it for their country. They did it for science. They didn't do it as a joyride. So there's a lot of backlash because these women are calling themselves astronauts. Come on. Where's the training? The training is opening the hatch door or buckling in. I had to do a lot more training for my U-2 flight, which was only 73,000 feet up. But I had that spacesuit. I had to learn how to use it. And that would have saved my life if there was a depressurization in our cockpit. So again, that is much more dangerous than it looks. And I remember talking to the U-2 pilots when I first, went there 8 years ago and trained. Didn't get the flight done until 8 years later out of Beale Air Force Base. But I told them I had flown, up to 84,000 feet in a MiG, but I didn't have a spacesuit on. And they said, "You're nuts." They said, anything would have happened, you were dead in 3 seconds. And that made me start thinking about that risk. And I pulled out of Virgin. And then I also interviewed Felix Baumgartner, the guy who had jumped out of the, Red Bull balloon back in 10 or 12 years ago and broke Joe Kittinger's world record. I think he jumped 128,000 feet. So I asked him, on his 10-year anniversary, I did an interview. I said, would you go up all the way to space if one of these companies took you? He said, hell no, they'd have to pay me. And I said, why? He said, because they don't wear spacesuits. So for me, those are the kind of risks that nobody thinks about. And there's going to be, and I hate to say it, like with the Titanic mess, like with Into Thin Air on Everest, there's going to be a depressurization on one of these flights, and it's going to kill all the people on board.
Right.
And then you're going to start seeing people wear spacesuits. So again, it's like I want that picture of me in space, but I'm not willing to train. I've got $1 million, so I'll pay that, or I'm a celebrity. But no, you have to earn it, and I have a problem with what's going on. And this is, you see it on Everest, you see it with space stuff now. We used to call it jumping the shark. When Fonzie,
I remember that. Yep, I saw that live when I was a kid.
Yeah,
Right.
And what it was the script writers were forgetting, they didn't have enough new stuff to do, so they made Fonzie jump the shark. And at that point, you sort of knew that the show was over in terms of longevity, because the writers were running out of ideas. So now we call things like that jumping the shark.
Well, it's getting more and more outlandish, right? When as we hurtle forward into all these different things that we're doing here, all of a sudden it gets more and more and more and do more of that, and we end up with trouble. And to your point, the more successful suborbital flights they have, there'll be more of them until there's a tragedy, and then there'll be less of them, because that's what human nature always does.
Yeah, and so I know why they don't wear spacesuits. They're expensive. I mean, that suit I had on for U2 was $250,000. They're bulky. You can't just unbuckle from your seat and float around. You got to stay in your seat. You could never get back in. You have a supplemental oxygen tank with you that's heavy. So and they could take less people, so it would cut into their profits. So I understand why they don't do it. But again, it's a disaster waiting to happen, and they should be more proactive for it. And again, it's just, we have the social media, it almost has to be up immediately. Like even I'm guilty of this. Like when I was out tornado chasing a couple weeks ago, when I saw my first tornado, I had to get it on Facebook right away. I had to get it on Instagram right away. Why? Because it didn't happen if it wasn't on social media.
Right. It gets faster and faster.
And social media, I think, is a real problem. And you've got these influencers who really haven't done anything, but they're able to talk people into thinking they had, and people don't check facts anymore. So I run into that all the time. So I guess it's the generation, me. Look at me, look at me, look at me. And you'll see stuff people put up, ridiculous posts like, I brushed my teeth this morning but ran out of toothpaste, or something. Just crazy stuff. I don't need to know that. Now, if I flew, in a MiG, that's something interesting to people, readers. So I guess I'm rambling here, but I just think maybe people.
Well, clearly it's something that you're very passionate about. Yeah. It appears to me like, if I feel like you're kind of bridging generations. Right. You've been doing this long enough to realize you remember the way that it was, and you see that the way that it is, and the way that it is, you find to be it bothers you. Right. And so therefore what you're doing is you're saying, hey, no, I've seen it differently. I mean, you sat in a room and you spoke with Chuck Yeager. Mm-hmm. I mean, think about that experience, right? The first one who breaks the sound barrier, and you have to wonder, what would Yeager, what would Glenn, what would Ride, what would they think about all of this today? And they'd never say it, but they'd probably be horrified. Right. Well, and so that's a dynamic.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I've been supersonic in 8 different planes now. It's crazy. I'm not even a pilot. Right. But I've been, F-18, F-16, MiG-20, Concorde. So what would Chuck Yeager say about me? But I don't pretend to be a pilot. All I do is write about it and let my reader experience it. Chuck Yeager risked his life to break the sound barrier, to be the first guy to do it. So, Neil Armstrong standing on the moon with Buzz Aldrin. I mean, they risked their lives for science, for their country. But to have somebody go up an 11-minute Blue Origin or Virgin Galactic flight and say they're astronauts, no. And you know what? If I were Jeff Bezos, and I'm not, and I certainly don't have his money, so why should I give him advice? But if I were him and this backlash happened, and, first of all, I don't know why they ever did it, but I would have a press conference and I would say, look, we were exuberant when we got out of the rocket, and we were full of adrenaline and joy. And so we talked about being astronauts, and no, we're not. We've thought about it. And, the American people sometimes they're pretty forgiving if you apologize. But if you dig in, I think Harvard Business School will probably write a case up about this in terms of PR, what not to do. Don't dig in. Apologize. They're not right.
So I have two other questions I want to ask you. I want to let you go. You've been very generous with your time. First thing, tell us about your podcast, Risky Business. Where can people find it, and what do you cover?
It's on hiatus right now, but it's people who have taken risks, kind of like I have, and they talk about it. I mean, I've had Sasha Cohen on, the great figure skater who won the silver for the U.S. in 2006. By the way, that's the last time the U.S. women have been on the podium in the Olympics, which is kind of shocking. We used to have one of the great figure skating teams in the world. So you can find it. I think it's on Spotify, and I've interviews with Cotty Cotton, a big wave surfer, surfed 80-foot waves in Nazare. I went out with him and was on a 60-foot wave on a jet ski, which was quite an experience. Who else is on it? Ron Capps, the great funny car racer for NHRA. Ed Viesters, the great mountaineer. We were going to do Mario Andretti, but the audio didn't work during the interview, so I managed to do a couple Forbes stories. But I think more important, if people want to read my stories, they should go to www.forbes.com/Jim Clash, and that will take you to my where all my stories are published at Forbes, and you can read about tornado chasing or hurricanes or mountain climbing or driving. I mean, I drove a Bugatti once at 253 miles an hour. That made a good story.
Yep. I mean, I will put all those links into the show notes. So guests, don't worry. Click on the show notes. They're waiting for you. I'll find the podcast link. I'll put those links in there.
Okay.
Last question for you. You've done all these amazing things, right? And it's a laundry list of accomplishment and adventure. What horizons do you have in front of you? What's down the road that's new for you?
It's getting harder and harder, honestly, to come up with things that I really want to do and take the risk behind it. Of course, I would like to fly suborbital with a spacesuit on, but I don't have the money, and they don't use spacesuits. Maybe in 20 years they will. That's something I'd love to do. I would love to take off and land on an aircraft carrier, like Tom Cruise did in the F-18 in Top Gun Maverick. I would love to interview Paul McCartney, Eric Clapton. Who else? I was just thinking about someone. Tom Cruise. I would love to talk to Tom Cruise because he does his own stunts. Some of them I'm like, I would not do that.
That's amazing. Yes.
Yeah. But yeah, in terms of things to do, like I just knocked a bunch off my bucket list the last couple of years. I mean, most recently tornado chasing, and it's hard to find a tornado, believe it or not. It's you can find the supercells that produce them. So for me, it was a bucket list item. Flying in the B-1 bomber was a bucket list item I did maybe 3 months ago. Refueled some Thunderbirds F-16s midair in a KC-135. Saw a total eclipse from 30,000 feet up in a T-38 fighter jet over Texas about a year ago. So it's getting harder and harder. And at my age, I'm not really climbing mountains anymore, and I would never go to Everest given what's going on there. But I have to think about stuff, I don't want to stop, but I got to be more selective. And there's certain things I just won't do, like somebody wanted me to go wing walking. No, I'm not. I don't want to go wing. It doesn't interest me, Will I go supersonic in another plane? Yeah, come on. Take me to Area 51 Air Force or put me in the old SR-71. I know some of those things are flying, but you won't admit it. Right. Stuff like that. So honestly, to answer your question, as you do more and more of these things, you need to go further and further and further into to the extreme. And to do those kind of things, it takes a lot of background effort. And as I say, with that U-2, it was 8 years before I actually got up in the plane. Very few civilians have ever flown that. To do the Bugatti when I drove 253 miles an hour. That took about 4 years planning with Bugatti and their agency. Neil Armstrong, by the way, took me 12 years to interview. So, there's your perseverance, right?
Well, there you have it, folks. Another episode of the Dark Zone Adventure Racing Podcast. Thanks, Jim, for coming on to the show. I think pound for pound, he name dropped the most famous people we've ever had on the show before. He He was a great guest and very gracious with his time. And please go to the show notes to find his link and go read his stuff. He is great. Thanks again for being here. We know that you could spend your time in a lot of places, and we are grateful that you are spending it at the Dark Zone. So please head over to your platform of choice and like, click, and subscribe. And as always, if you keep racing, guess what? We'll keep talking.